On patreon.com/consensusunreality you will find bonus episodes, written content and much more. This recording contains an exclusive follow-up and bonus episode only on Patreon. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Consensus Unreality. Today we are joined by paranormal and occult researcher and personality AP Strange, host of the AP Strange Show podcast. And we've kind of been hovering around the same topics for a while now. I believe I first came in contact with you through Eugenia Makes Her Story research. And then through Apport, the bookstore kind of situation. So it's kind of cool to bring you on the show here, talk about paranormal stuff. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for being a purveyor of books and draining my bank account.
Anytime, yeah, easy. So we were talking a couple of days ago, and you had recently been looking into Aleister Crowley and Loch Ness as a potential area of interest and research. And we had just done a Crowley episode, kind of wrapping up our pulp magic series about Eastern and Western confluences in the occult. So I figured we could start by kind of talking about Crowley and Loch Ness and what you kind of uncovered there, if anything, or how that was for you.
Yeah. Well, the idea was over the summer, I wanted to do kind of a presentation somewhere local. I was kind of toying with the idea of doing a series of local presentations live. And I still want to do it, but I got bogged down with the Loch Ness Monster one because it wasn't going to be exclusively about Crowley and Loch Ness. It was supposed to be about the title I had in my mind was the misunderstood magic of the monster of Ness. So that where Crowley plays a big part in that, because lore wise, right? There's a whole mythology about that, where people kind of offhand will say, well, he did this crazy ritual and then he botched it, and then because of that the Loch Ness Monster popped up. And that's kind of like the shorthand, very simplified narrative that you sometimes hear, right? So in order to unpack that, it required me to do a lot of research on Crowley, who I've never really resonated with. So it was difficult because, I've gone back and forth from actively disliking him to tolerating him to respecting him on some levels. And and a genuine appreciation. And these days it's kind of I think I can firmly say now, and I think your episode on him recently was really good, and it kind of approximated where I'm at, is that there's really several different Crowleys, right? There's so there's the popular imagination of him. There's the people that are detractors that write their own version of him. There's his own personal self-mythologizing, which changes depending on what era he's writing. I mean, he is fascinating in a lot of ways, but I do kind of, it's kind of a slog for me to get through his actual writing. I'm not a big fan, and I feel bad saying that, but nothing against people that are Thelemites or do really genuinely appreciate him, but it's really just not my kind of magical cup of tea, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we said a lot in our episode is that he's so unavoidable in this thing. I mean, you would like or dislike him, you can't really avoid. He's almost like a hyper object of lore, of self-generating lore, of mythology, and also, a lot of the what we think of as Western esotericism, ceremonial magic, so much of that generates from him too. So then you got to parse out the biography, his insane, which is a whole nother thing. Like I can't believe nobody has made a biographical movie about Aleister Crowley in any capacity, because his biography alone is so insane and fascinating. But yeah, I mean, he's just unavoidable, right?
He is, and especially looms large as a mythological figure, particularly to people that have no occult practice themselves.
Yeah.
So and that was kind of where I was coming from, is that if you're talking about the Loch Ness Monster, you're primarily dealing with people that are interested in cryptozoology, or just monsters, or maybe folklorists would be interested in stuff like that. So when you bring Crowley into the mix, it's tough because these are a lot of people that don't have any experiential knowledge of occult practice, and they don't have the background to understand what the Abramelin ritual would have been, so and I love that old occult stuff, but and then when you get into like conspiracy theory, there's a lot of stuff that Crowley just is a boogeyman in the conspiracy world a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And people conflate him with Satanism, which sometimes seems fair and other times maybe not so much. But it shows a marked misunderstanding or lack of engagement with the actual source material and what he was all about. So
did you end up doing a lot of research on the Abramelin itself? I was kind of refreshing myself on it a little bit recently. Yeah. It's
I mean, that was the bulk of my interest, but moreover, I wanted an accurate timeline of what exactly he did out of it in Boleskine House. So, but yeah, I had to read all the source material I could find. I have, it's the Ibis Press edition that came out. I know Ron Milo Duquette was involved with that, and I forget the main guy that was compiling and editing it. Forgetting his name right now, but it's really good. It's got all of the sources put together, and a much more comprehensive version of the Abramelin materials from Abraham than what Crowley had access to at the time. So,
which was the Mather? Was it the Mathers version, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Mathers had only recently translated, I think. So, I mean, obviously they were contemporaries. He was a student of Mathers.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So I've heard essentially that the Abramelin is. It's kind of like an amalgamation of like folk magic, and then I guess it's ceremonial magic, but it's different in that there's not really incantations, there's not sigils, and
there's magic squares.
There's magic squares, yeah, and it kind of even there's a portion in it that almost demonizes like pentacles, right? It talks about pentacles being the currency of souls, I think.
Yeah. Well, if you look at it, it's like this is mostly a book written by a rabbi as like a letter to his son who he wants to carry on this tradition. So there's a whole philosophical treatise before you even get to like the magic stuff.
Yeah,
which by comparison is small, and it's to me it just sounds like a rabbi explaining how you should live a good life and a pure life, and prepare yourself for conversation with the higher guardian angel. And so I mean I don't see a lot that seems evil in there. Like
yeah,
that's the funny thing. People act like it's it's some kind of demonic ritual or some satanic affair, and you're just like, no, this is a rabbi writing a letter to his son about how to be a good man for the most part.
So, did you find that connection of like Crowley and Loch Ness, does that generate from like F.W. Holiday? Is that kind of the starting point? I know there was the priest in the 70s who did the exorcism on the loch, and I think that
Yep.
was kind of tied to it, right?
Well, Holiday does mention Crowley and his activities at Boleskine in his book, The Dragon and the Disc. And I'm not sure if that's the first time that came up, but I mean, I'm sure it had been noted before. And there's a whole mythology around Boleskine House. I actually have a piece of Boleskine House in a box in the other room, mounted on my wall in the display case. This has long been an obsession of mine. But you know, for listeners maybe that don't know, that's kind of where it was a huge estate that Crowley bought. Like it wasn't even for sale. He just kind of showed up and he's like, this would be a perfect place for me to do the Abramelin. And he tried to buy it, and the woman that was there was just like, it's not for sale. So he just offered her an outrageous sum of money, and she was like, well, I guess I got to take it, you know. But I mean, you can kind of overlook Ness from there, but it's not right on the shore. And I think that's one impression that people maybe get wrong, is that it's not like the Castle Urquhart. It's not like right there on the beach. So that's one thing to consider with it. But also, losing my train of thought. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah. And then there's this whole history about the house itself, because Crowley really didn't spend a ton of time there. He was there for a little while, and then he got married and took off. And that's where the Book of the Law comes into the timeline for him. And he pretty much ignored that for a long time before he finally ended up back there after the death of his child, and when he was kind of on the outs with his wife, his first wife, who a lot of people say like went crazy and had to be institutionalized. But she was institutionalized for dipsomania, which basically she had a drinking problem anyway, and she was grieving the loss of a child, and her husband blamed her for it. So it's really kind of no wonder she fell into a depressed and drunken state. You know, it's not really as spooky and creepy as it sounds. But
right.
This is all the stuff that I've come to realize recently. But moreover, so I mean, moving forward in time, Boleskine eventually gets bought by Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, so it has this whole rock star mystique to it as well. He also didn't live there that long. You know, well, he owned it for quite a while, but he would rarely live there. You know, he was on tour a lot, so he had a caretaker that lived there, and there were stories about it being haunted. And then in more recent history, it's burned down twice. So there's a current effort underway to restore it back to what it was. That's why I own a piece of it, because I bought a piece to go toward the restoration effort there. But I think an important takeaway here is how young Crowley was at the time. So, like I said, when you're reading the Abramelin, Abraham kind of has, and this was the rabbi that relates the Abramelin ritual in the book, Abraham von Worms. He's talking about living a life where you've lived a full life and a chaste life, and you're doing all this stuff. Crowley was incredibly young. Like, he didn't have a lot of life experience. Like, he tried to get on the fast track to illumination, which is why a lot of the Golden Dawn members kind of resented him. Is what I'm taking away from what I've looked at, you know. So anyway, I'm probably rambling right now, but
no, and that's kind of that whole debacle with the Golden Dawn. Isn't that partially what drew him away from Boleskine as well?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where it all gets so confusing, because he does leave Boleskine initially because he's going to aid Mathers, I guess, because there's this division, and he stays he stays loyal to Mathers and tries to reclaim the Golden Dawn at that point. But his first marriage is in there somewhere, which seemed at first to be like a marriage of convenience and in part to piss off his mother.
Yeah, to piss off a few people, I think, right?
Right.
As I recall,
It was his friend's sister.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So he had a hell of a lot of things going on. But again, he was in his early 20s. He had a huge inheritance and was so wealthy that he actually didn't understand how money worked. Like if you read Rigardi's book, there's a quote from him where he admits that in his younger years, he didn't know it was possible to run out of money. He thought there was like an infinite well. Because he didn't handle money himself. Other people did it for him, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Huh. So where does the idea come from that something that Crowley himself did produced something that could be seen as like a monster? Where does that what was the cause and effect in the mythology there?
Well, when you're doing the Abramelin ritual, it's a long process, as I'm sure you guys are aware. You know, you're supposed to be at it pretty much for a year and a half. It's broken up into a couple sections, and part of that is calling down. You're supposed to get in touch with the higher guardian angel and then follow directions from the angel, your personal higher guardian angel. So then it becomes less ritual that is in the book and more direction from a higher source to you that's highly personalized. But during that time, you're calling in demons and then releasing them, banishing them, and you're doing it over and over again. And there is at least one magic square in there where you're supposed to summon a dragon. So I don't know that anybody got into it deeply enough to find that. But I think really the legend comes from, if indeed it came from Holiday, was really just matching the timelines of the first modern sightings of the Loch Ness Monster being kind of, you know, within a decade or so of Crowley's time at Boleskine, you know. So it's kind of
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say it's just kind of a conclusion one might draw because Crowley was there doing all this magic stuff, and then a little while later, people are seeing this monster, you know.
Yeah, when was the first sighting really? Is it like 1910s?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think right around then. Because there were a couple leading up to the 1930s. The famous surgeon's photo was during the early 1930s, and that was kind of after there was already a hoopla about it because people had been seeing the monster here and there for a while. It actually kind of harkens back to earlier monster sightings and hoaxes in the United States, places like Champlain. Even Lake George had a hoaxed monster in it for a while. You know, the Connecticut River. There were a whole lot of monsters that were kind of some that were kind of legitimately seen, I guess, and others that were known to be hoaxes. You know, rich people pulling pranks on people. So there's a through line there too. But also, you know, Holiday tracks the iconography of dragons and worms all over the world going back over the centuries. So I think there's an argument to be made that there was a spirit of place with Loch Ness that was kind of that might have been tapped into, you know. But as far as Loch Ness Monster being a direct result of Crowley's workings, I don't really see evidence for that. I think you can have unintended consequences, but I think the narrative that I started out with, that basically did some crazy spooky ritual, messed it up, and boom, Loch Ness Monster. It isn't really that simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it reminds so much of something that would be in a Kenneth Grant book, although funny enough, I don't, like, having read a lot of Grant, I don't think I've ever encountered the Loch Ness Crowley thing specifically, but it would be like a tangential tantrum is what he calls like the unexpected effects of a ritual working.
Oh, right. And I mean, I could see Nessie being one of the old ones.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But anytime you hear about the Loch Ness Monster, journalists, if they write about Nessie, are going to reference Saint Columba and the story in the River Ness of an actual Irish saint banishing Nessie in like 585, I think the year was. So it's the story of a beast in the water that was attacking a man, and the saint came out and made it go away with the power of Christ, compelling it. So, so I mean, there's this. I would believe that Nessie is some sort of magical entity. If that's the only thing that really makes sense to me, other than perhaps like a sentient plasmoid peat moss aggregation.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But
I love those ideas of it. Do you remember who it was who said it was some sort of like slug creature?
Doc Shields. Oh, well,
Yeah.
no, Holiday suggested that first.
Yeah.
He thought it might have been, his first book was The Great Orm of Loch Ness. And in that book, he suggested that it might have been a Telemonstrum gregarium, which we have in the fossil record as kind of a giant slug, basically.
Yeah.
But I mean, our fossil record of it is very small ones. But the idea is they could have gotten massive.
Right.
So they call it a Tully's monster. And if you see the imprints that we have of it look like the long-necked kind of serpentine features. And Holiday changed his mind several times before he unfortunately passed away young. But yeah, he was part of the exorcism of Loch Ness. That was a very entertaining man named Father Donald Omond. Well, the Reverend Dr. Donald Omond. He was quite a character. In addition to exorcising the Loch Ness Monster, he also exorcised the Bermuda Triangle.
Right.
He tangled with a couple vampires. May have even gone up against Dracula. And he exorcised notoriously bad traffic spots in the UK where there had been a lot of accidents.
That's awesome.
He called them black spots, and he would because there was a negative energy well there, I guess, that caused people to crash into each other. So he had to go exercise those places. So
yeah,
interesting
that rings
character.
a bell. Yeah, that's great. Huh.
So
yeah,
that would have been in the 1970s, though.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, long after.
Have either of you read Monstrum, A Wizard's Tale by Doc Shields?
No, I haven't.
Well, you both need to read that because you'll love
it. What's the deal with that?
Okay, so Tony Doc Shields, he just passed away last year. This is where I would have wanted to go with a presentation on conjuring the Loch Ness Monster. That was kind of his claim to fame, is that he went to Loch Ness. If you've ever seen the full color photo of Nessie, where she's popping out of the water and her mouth looks like it's open a little bit, and it's one of those too good to be true photos. That was the one Doc Shields took, and he claimed that he had called her and she came. So he was a busker, a sleight of hand magician. He had his own personal brand of what he called bizarre magic, where he worked occult themes and tarot cards and all kinds of other spooky effects into basic stage magic stuff. He did plays with his family. They were pretty risque. And he was a wacky, borderline Discordian kind of performance artist and huckster, but had a legitimate magic that was just kind of so silly that it worked. It was kind of the way he put it, is that my magic is ridiculous and no one's going to believe me, and that's why it works.
Yeah.
So he unfortunately passed away this past summer, actually. And I was a little bit bummed about that because I hadn't really even been sure he was still alive. But he's basically a hero of mine. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not super familiar. The name definitely rings a bell, but yeah, there's it's always interesting when there's somebody in this realm that I just haven't really dug into yet.
Yeah,
I think it's partly a product of him being much more well known in the UK.
Yeah, true.
Oh,
yeah.
Does that book go into a bunch of other stuff as well?
It does, because he was a regular contributor to the 14 Times in the late 70s. So much in line with other writers that were often in it at the time, when Lauren Coleman would write for that, or Robert Anton Wilson was writing for it. They were kind of obsessed with like a lot of Jungian stuff and synchromysticism and synchronicity and James Joyce and like all of these different kind of metaphysical plays on words and stuff like that. And Doc Shields is right in that milieu. So so his book follows that way, where he talks about his love of a pint of Guinness, and it's breaking down the name Guinness, including the name Ness. And he gets into pukas and he gets into surrealism. He was also a surrealist artist. So he's got a real kind of Joycean stream of consciousness thing going on about halfway through. So it's really psychedelic without any psychedelic drugs being involved. It's just a real head trip, and it's really funny. So if you like Robert Anton Wilson, or you like a lot of other kind of psychedelic and psychedelic adjacent kind of Discordian style weirdness, you'll definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, you mentioned pukas. It reminds me of the Shelby Downard thing too. I'm sure he must have brushed up against that, because it seems the whole 14th circle was influencing that stuff, or maybe
that's right around that time.
Yeah.
It is right around that time. So and he directly references Robert Anton Wilson anyway during that time. So if you look at, I think his column was called "Words from a Wizard," and that was in 14 Times from, I think, like 76 to about 80, 81, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you have to figure Jim Brandon was well aware of his work, and Brandon is sending the Sirius Rising tape to Robert Anton Wilson, which gets Shelby Downard on his radar and all that business. That's pretty funny. I just wanted to circle back to the Crowley thing too. Is Leviathan named in the Abramelin? Is that kind of where a lot of people are garnering that connection?
I believe so, but I didn't really put that together before. But yeah, that's possible.
I've definitely heard that. Yeah, I haven't read the Abramelin myself. Just kind of looked at things about it, but
yeah, I mean, you'll find a lot of the familiar Goetic names in there. So yeah, that does, if I recall correctly, that does appear in there. I was looking more for specific references to dragons or worms or anything like that, and that I didn't manage to find that. There is references to dragons with one of the magic squares. So yeah.
The location of the rabbi worms.
Right.
Yep,
Yeah.
I've noted that before in my writings about it. Is that's also kind of a weird, like, synchronistic connection.
Great, it's a joke, I guess. It's funny when these things end up being jokes, or like who's telling the joke and who's it for.
Yeah, it's the cosmic trickster.
Yeah,
having a laugh at our expense.
Huh. Yeah,
So
that's wild.
what did you find to be like the actual result? Like, what in your approximation is the actual results for Crowley of his work with the Abramelin? I know he talked about some materializations and stuff.
I think it's unclear, really. I mean, I don't think anybody will ever really know. But I think it had whatever it was had a lasting impact on Crowley. And I think it's really a result of too much too soon. Like, you're going to crash and burn. Most people realize, I would hope, most people that start dabbling in cultism and actually practicing it would realize pretty quickly, oh, this is going to be a lifelong affair. Like, this is not something I'm going to figure out in a year. I'm not going to figure it out in 2 years. But Crowley was arrogant enough to think he would, you know. So it's kind of a crash and burn from flaming out from gnosis too early, I guess. So whatever happened had a nasty effect on him, and I don't think that I don't think he was in a good place to be doing it anyway, especially returning to it after the death of his child and kind of estrangement from his wife, or at least, he blamed her, because they had basically trekked across China, like all the way across China with a baby. So it's kind of
And he made her travel back alone and
yeah, he hopped on a boat and
I
he's like,
think.
yeah, like, good luck, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's a wild story. I think my opinion was greatly changed by Rigardi's accounting of it in The Eye in the Triangle. I think that's a great book, but some people criticize it because they say that Rigardi had a bone to pick with him and they weren't on good terms. But he was actually writing it as a response to, like, the Simons book and the other books that were basically vilifying Crowley or building up this mythology of him as a demonic figure, you know.
Yeah. It's
And then of course there's Crowley's own account of things, his own
Right.
autohagiography. So
right, exactly, yeah.
It's crazy. This one person has. I can't think of anyone else who has the same like literature about him. At least in this field.
who's that, Rigardi?
No, Crowley. Just like I
Oh,
can't
right.
think of anyone who has a body of work sort of surrounding him in the same volume.
Yeah, the variance in biographical material, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you have this.
Well, I always end up kind of inadvertently comparing him to Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah.
I think she has those really. I mean, I don't think you find two bigger, more controversial figures in modern occultism that divide people more, you know.
Yeah.
I guess.
And ironically, I think Crowley comes out ahead all the time, even though he has so many detractors, you know. And I often wonder why.
Yeah, I think maybe I think about it in, like, because we were talking about this on our episode too, because the bad accusations loom so large that you kind of easily brush him away if you're not accusing him of being like a Satanist or something, right? Like, oh, the great beast. Like, the worst accusations are such hyper objects that you kind of just cast him away, and then he can fall into this niche of being this, like, cultural pop icon, you know, some rare kind of weird influence on the 60s and stuff like that. But there's a lot of despicable regular things once you look at the biographies, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm sure you've encountered that. But yeah, I mean, like Ben's mentioning too, like I really love the Francis X. King biography of Crowley, and I feel like he plays it pretty straight. He just really uses a lot of the letters and, you know, documentation and accounts of the people associated with Crowley, and, you know, the amazing wake that he left in the lives of everybody he knew. So much like desolation and shit, just of everybody who was close to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, like I said earlier, it's a hard-headed kind of damn the consequences, just move forward kind of move, and I think I think I appreciated Rigardi's biography of him because Rigardi was also familiar with the practice and the ritual that was referenced in all these things, and where other biographers maybe were not as much, But I haven't read the King one, so I'm not really sure. I'd like to read the Kaczynski Perturabo book. I think that would. One of these days, I'll get around to getting that one.
Yeah. Yeah, King wrote a lot of books on. He was definitely familiar. He wrote a lot of books on magic and ceremonial magic, 20th century occult stuff, and kind of documented the mythography of like new movements in ceremonial magic or occult or whatever, Western esoterica in the 20th century. But yeah, that makes sense for the Rigardi one because they're obviously, you could talk about the negative, but of course there's, the genius of amalgamating and syncretizing all these different techniques towards that enlightenment, like the calling of the ethers in the working in help me out here, Algiers, in the desert, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The crossing of the abyss and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I mainly take issue with, and I see people do when they try to get a shorthand version of stuff, is not engaging with the material of the practice, like what it was that they were trying to accomplish, and getting little details wrong, because even those little details will go a long way toward you having a really bad, like, wrong-headed idea of what was happening,
Yeah.
So So yeah, these are complicated characters we're talking about, and you could devote a lifetime of study to any of them. And I basically derailed my whole Loch Ness Monster idea because I really wanted to get Crowley right.
Yeah, right. That'll happen for sure. I mean, it's all the characters are complicated, and even the texts are complicated. Like if you look at something like the Abramelin and just kind of figuring out what the place of that thing is and what the lineage of that is and the effects of it are, where it sits, because some people argue it's not even a Jewish text, right? Like some people argue it's a later Christian text because some of the Hebrew is like kind of botched, but we don't really know if that's from later translations, right?
I don't think Abraham claimed it was a Hebrew thing, and he learned it from Abramelin, allegedly, who was like an Egyptian magician. So it was kind of like the syncretized thing already.
Yeah.
Like he just transcribed it in Hebrew.
Right.
Or somebody else did to make it seem like it was a more legitimate Hebrew text.
Yeah. That's kind of what I've heard. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting. I mean, the more we kind of backfill our conception of history, it kind of just shows that there's so many of these rituals, and what we deem to be the Western occult tradition is, this strange compilement of so many different things, just stacked on top, Legoed on top of each other.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to pick it apart and see where it comes from. Like I had mentioned to Ben in a private message that the book The Clouds Upon the Sanctuary by von Eckarthausen.
Yeah.
That was kind of foundational for Crowley's introduction to the Golden Dawn, because Arthur Waite had given him the book and said, this is something you should look at. And it kind of introduces this idea of like a chosen brotherhood of kind of ethereal presence and stuff like that. Basically, the Great White Brotherhood or the Secret Chiefs, and this is something that was being written around the time of the actual Illuminati. Von
Right.
Eckarthausen was a member of the Illuminati briefly, but he was a Christian mystic and thinker, and it's kind of interesting to see like that idea comes from somebody that was very Christian, talking about like saintly beings coming down, but it often gets ascribed to like Blavatsky as something that she misinterpreted from Eastern religion,
Mm.
and it's kind of you have to wonder, like going back a little further, like where did von Eckarthausen get that from?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it's tied up with like the Rosicrucians. That's the same basic era, right?
Well, the Rosicrucians is that's a whole mess. Like that is
Yeah.
like that is a big tangled knot going back
Yeah,
to I think the 16th century. Um,
right.
so von Eckarthausen would have been the tail end of the 18th century. Uh,
Yeah, so certainly aware of the who was the writer behind like the Chemical Wedding was Andreas on something like that.
yeah, I'm not going to recall that at the moment.
Yeah, I'm trying, but it's well, of course it was Christian Rosenkreuz
Right.
Yeah.
was the pseudonym, but I think that people feel confident that it was this one writer who had written other sort of allegorical things. But yeah, the whole Rosicrucian mania,
Yeah, and I
yeah,
mean that's great because to me that's kind of like it's almost like the Discordians in a way, where like people would just claim to be a Rosicrucian because it sounded good, or
Definitely.
right,
like
Yeah.
yeah, and then uh, basically, uh, there may have been actual Rosicrucians. There may have been groups that called themselves Rosicrucian, but were really just a loose confederacy of like intellectuals and
Mm,
elites. And there may have been people that were promulgating the idea of a Rosicrucian thing that didn't exist. And all of these things are simultaneously true. So
right,
you can't pick that apart, especially now, because half of the sources are going to be, or more than half, 2/3 of the sources are completely unreliable because
Yeah.
because they're serving a different purpose than historical accuracy. Um,
right.
and I think that's great because it leaves so much room for interpretation. I think it's awesome, and it is like myth making. So I mean, quite literally, it's building a myth. Like, was Sir Francis Bacon a Rosicrucian? Oh, maybe,
Hmm.
maybe not.
Yeah.
Like, was Shakespeare a real person, or was he just like made up by the Rosicrucians? Who knows?
Yeah,
Start entertaining all the craziest ideas that you can think of.
Yeah.
Um,
Bacon gets a lot of that heat. Bacon gets
he does.
the Shakespeare thing and the Rosicrucian thing.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you start rolling in every historical figure that's even remotely occult, and start wondering about John Dee. You start wondering about George Faust, maybe. Who knows? So,
Yeah, they
um,
basically are like it's in an early ARG. I wouldn't even claim that it's the first because I'm sure you could cite examples of earlier stuff that's have
well, Pythagoras,
sure, right, exactly. Yeah.
Pythagorean cults and stuff like that. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
Pythagoras and
But
Orpheus, yeah, right.
yep, exactly. The
Yeah.
different cults that were, or the different streams of mystery schools that existed back in ancient Greece.
Mm.
It goes right back to the beginning, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's true.
yeah. It's fun. Yeah, it's fun to feel that there's a club that just by professing membership, it kind of adds a layer of mystery to your to your like life. I feel
Yeah.
like that's probably eternal. Yeah.
And this is something that also throws people off the trail if they're not engaging with the process of manifesting and mythologizing and basically adding form to an occult practice and making it real. You're
Mm.
reifying it by talking about it and by adding to the credentials of it. So I think if people start hearing, oh well, these people claimed they were Rosicrucians, but they were just having a laugh. It's like, well, then they conclude there was no Rosicrucian group, like that wasn't a real thing, and then they're stuck there. and that's where they'll always be, you know.
Yeah.
And this happens with every aspect of the paranormal, and particularly when the paranormal borders on magic, ritual, and occult, and mysticism and esotericism, is because people get the idea that one example of deception means that the whole thing is bunk.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a level of deception in everything for sure.
I feel like that's a good way to pivot into talking about your research into Houdini, maybe.
Right. I
Um,
was thinking the same thing, actually.
yeah. So I mean, of course he was, he's like the magician, and magician being the same word that we'd use for someone like Crowley. What are the where do these two things overlap and why?
Well, my interest in Houdini was actually because of the idea that he may have been a spy. That was the
Hmm.
thing that got me into him originally. But then I started becoming fascinated by the magic tricks he did, and then that started me down a path of teaching myself sleight of hand and magic tricks and learning how they're all done.
Hmm.
And this is a good example of what I was just saying about ritual magic, where there's lies that are part of the program that sometimes you have to suspend your disbelief and just learn and agree to. Um, Stage magic is exactly the same. Stage magicians have a code where you're not supposed to explain how the trick is done to non magicians, right?
Yeah.
And you will find accounts like from the 1800s of some English dude in India watching fakirs doing a buried alive ritual, and they'll be like, "Oh, Sahib, let me show you how this trick is done," and basically they have this long explanation. They lower the coffin into the ground, and then the fakir climbs out and he scrambles through this tunnel that you couldn't see, and then he pops out through a hollowed tree, and then he goes about his life, and and then he comes back like a month later and slips back down through the same tunnel and gets in the coffin, so that when you open it up it looks like he's totally fine. And that's how the trick is done, and this gets recorded, and this has been in a million books, and I read that as somebody that knows how to do some magic tricks, and I'm like, that is absolutely not how that trick was done. There's so many steps there. That's just absurd. I can think of half a dozen to a dozen other ways that you could do the same trick without a tunnel, without a hollowed out tree. Like that's just ridiculous. That's part of the magic. Part of the magic trick is leading somebody to believe that they know how it was done. And they don't. At the end of the day, they don't. The real
Huh.
magic, illusions, the way illusions work is they're so ridiculously simple that if you have the trick explained to you, you'll slap yourself in the forehead for missing it. It's like and if you have it explained to you as, "Hey, I want you to do this trick," you'll say to yourself or the person telling you this, "That'll never work. Like that wouldn't fool anybody." That's how it always works. They're always way simpler than you think. So that that was one thing I came to realize through Houdini, and it's also true of a lot of a lot of actual spooky like ritual magic stuff. Like the actual mechanism behind it is incredibly simple, but you have to go through a hell of a lot of dark nights of the soul and torturous reading and wrestling with your own belief and your own self-image and the illusions of reality before you come to the conclusion that, hey, it's actually pretty simple. But the idea of Houdini being a spy was really interesting to me. And there is a book called The Secret Life of Houdini, The Making of America's First Superhero by, well, the authors are Sloman and Kalush. And that was a really good book. But, that also touches on spiritualism. And
Right.
that was what Houdini spent a lot of his time. He occupied a lot of his later life with debunking mediums and spiritualists. And again, that's another thing that gets oversimplified and kind of mythologized in weird ways. And that was kind of what I was looking at recently. I wanted to do a presentation locally because where I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, is actually significant in Houdini's life in a number of ways that I thought were really interesting, and it would be kind of cool to do a presentation for any locals who care
Yeah.
about that kind of weird history. But
Yeah. What was his kind of his process, or like why was he trying to debunk these spiritualists? Was he involved with like Conan Doyle? Or, like was there kind
yep,
of something there? That's what I remember. Those
yeah,
two somehow.
yeah. Him and Arthur Conan Doyle had a weird bromance going on, where Doyle was a huge fan of Houdini, and Houdini was an admirer of Doyle's work, and they were friends. But their friendship was strained because, Doyle was a spiritualist, a professed spiritualist. His wife, Lady Doyle, was a medium, and she actually did a sitting for Houdini and tried to contact his mother
Mm.
through automatic writing, and that was Houdini's main interest, was um, contacting his mother after she passed away, because they had an incredibly close bond. Um, Now, it's interesting to note that Houdini and his wife Bess early on had their own seance uh, routine that they did on stage. And at one point, I think it was like, I think there was like a murder case or something, and that ended up being like uh, rolled into the performance. And the family got really upset, and Houdini saw how much you could really mess somebody up by
Mm,
pretending that you contacted a dead loved one.
Mm.
And he realized
right.
how rotten a thing that was to do, and he stopped doing it. And incidentally, the act that Bess and Harry had on stage was the means through which he was supposed to communicate from beyond the grave, and it was known only to them. So, so when you hear about having seances to contact Houdini post his death, um, they were supposed to get a very specific message that was in the same code that they would have used when they're doing fake seances on stage.
Mm,
So if you're following me here, if the listeners are following me,
Yeah.
you see how this is the kind of thing I really love, where you're going through levels of deception and weird, spooky stuff, and uh, performance, and
yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's all fascinating.
Mm.
But what
Huh.
happened was that Lady Doyle did this automatic writing, and she came up with a message in English referring to him as Harry. And the problem was that Houdini's mother never really spoke English. They were from like Budapest. Like she would speak like in a Hungarian kind of dialect, so she would never have come through from the other side speaking English.
Mm.
And
Right.
she didn't call him Harry, because that wasn't his real name. His real name was Eric. The
Huh.
way she said it sounded kind of like Harry. That's where he got the name, because she
Mm,
would say Airy. I would just not pronounce the ch at the end. But yeah, I mean, the to write it out Harry is not something his mother would have done.
Mm.
So so I mean, Houdini was never convinced that Lady Doyle was a medium, and Arthur Conan Doyle was absolutely convinced that Harry Houdini was a superhuman. Um, and to give you an idea of how credulous he is, if we're to believe everything that was written, because I have a secret kind of conspiracy theory idea that Conan Doyle was pretending to be a doddering old man for nefarious reasons. But when you're a little kid and you have like a weird uncle that comes up to you and he shows you that he can remove his own thumb and then
Uh-huh.
put it back on, that old trick.
yeah.
That's what Harry Houdini did in the back of a cab, and Conan Doyle thought it was an amazing act of sorcery. Like truly, you have amazing powers, my friend.
That's awesome.
What? Yeah,
So
that's wild.
no, it is, and it's weird, and people really have a hard time squaring that the man behind like the greatest detective genius in the world,
Right.
their fiction, Sherlock Holmes, would be so easy to fool in real life.
Right. Yeah, that's weird. It's almost like he's channeling the spirit of Sherlock instead.
Yeah, I mean, right. Um, yeah, or he just kind of, yeah, it's almost like he exercised Sherlock from himself by writing it.
Yeah, right.
Right. That's
I
funny.
mean,
Yeah.
there's other things with Conan Doyle that make me wonder because I think he was, I think he did a court case at one point where he tried to play detective with some kind of minor court case in England, and he turned out to be a pretty lousy detective in real life.
Mm,
Like he was really good at coming up with these stories, but
Yeah. I guess
um,
if you know how it's going to end, it's pretty easy to be a good detective.
yeah.
right. And if you read Sherlock Holmes stories, there's a lot of like you wouldn't guess what's going to happen because he doesn't give you all the information ahead of time. Like
Right.
have you ever read the first one? Like uh, it's like a study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes story.
Mm,
I think so.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
because like the killer in it ends up being like this Mormon from the U.S. There's this whole
Yeah.
backstory, so you get that at the end. You're like, well, we never would have known that. That doesn't like
yeah.
you didn't give us any clues to help figure it out. Like with Agatha
Yeah.
Christie, you can sit there and guess. You'd be like, oh, okay, so she's dropping hints here. But yeah, but yeah, Conan Doyle could not be swayed to believe that there are ways of tricking people because he was I, either he was pretending to be dense, which I think is totally possible. It, only because so suppose just the espionage angle. If you're playing dumb all the time, and then you're kind of people are saying something that they figure is okay to say around you because you're too dumb to put it together.
Mm,
Like maybe it's kind of a stretch, but there are people that think he was part of the Piltdown Man conspiracy, um, like burying an orangutan skeleton somewhere in the UK to try to say it was like the missing link, you know,
yeah, that's like
just
Right.
the Desjardins thing, right?
yeah,
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 yeah.
and just to embarrass the scientific community
Hmm.
was the whole point of it. Um, but yeah, there's a really striking story that I was kind of going to begin my presentation with, where um, Houdini basically tells Conan Doyle, "What I want you to do is leave the house that we're in right now, walk down the street, write down a phrase on a piece of paper, and put it in your pocket, and then come back. And don't tell me what it is. And then this phrase is going to end up written on a piece of slate that I have hanging, and that's free hanging on the in the air from a couple wires hanging from the ceiling." And he did it. They basically had a couple cork balls. He was allowed to inspect the cork balls. The cork balls got put into a white solution of some kind. I don't remember exactly what it was, white paint or something. Um, and then he was allowed to select one at random, and they put that ball on the slate, which is hanging again, so it's perpendicular to the ground. And the cork ball began to move on its own, and it spelled out exactly the words that Conan Doyle had written, and it was many, many echo apartsen, which is from the Bible. It's the writing on the wall in the in that book of the Old Testament. So uh, you know, Houdini basically said, "I'm not going to tell you how I managed to do the trick, but I am going to tell you it's a trick. This is a trick. This wasn't ghosts. This isn't sorcery. This was an illusion. This was a trick, and it's an impressive one, you know." But I'm not going to explain it to you, but I will tell you it's not real. And Conan Doyle still couldn't believe it. And that is an impressive trick. And I have my own ideas about how it was accomplished, but
Huh.
um,
Has it ever been talked to? Has anyone ever figured it out?
yeah, I mean, the Houdini's assistant, who actually designed a lot of the contraptions that he would escape from, and a lot of the tricks and stuff, and helped him do it, admitted later to being an accomplice and hiding inside of a compartment inside of the bookcase, using a rod with a magnet on the end of it to control the movement of the cork ball from the other side of the slate. I also don't necessarily think that was the case. I think there's other explanations for it. He may have been lying. That's the whole thing. Everybody might be lying all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had a pretty tremendous falling out because it kind of hurt Conan Doyle deeply that essentially he felt that Houdini was attacking his religion, because spiritualism is a religion. You know, it's not just a loose group of mediums or hoaxers. It's people that have a religious belief that, and it's a proto-Christian belief. They're essentially Christian, and they believe that God can endow you with these abilities to be in contact with those who have passed on, or have foreknowledge of things, or have psychometric powers. And so to Conan Doyle, it was a religious thing, and he felt that his religion was under siege through Houdini going after all of his friends. And a lot of his friends were con artists. So and this is one thing that people misunderstand about Houdini, is he was legitimately interested in talking to his mother. He always hoped he would find evidence, or that he would make that connection. He was basically rooting for the idea of contact with the beyond. But everybody he encountered, he figured out how they were fooling people. And what Houdini didn't like was the way Houdini said it was, I'm lying to people, but they know that I'm lying to them when I perform. When I come on stage, they know it's a trick. They're paying to be tricked. When they pay a spiritualist and they get a fake seance out of it, they're paying to speak to a loved one, and they're getting ripped off. So there's a legitimate business to be done tricking people for entertainment. And from his perspective, they were doing actual harm, both emotional and financial, to people. But beyond that, in that book that I mentioned, The Secret Life of Houdini, they suggest if there was actually an espionage angle, there were a whole lot of spiritualists in pretty much all of Congress and the Senate and even the White House during the 1920s, doing seances for politicians, which, if you're sourcing information about people to use under the pretense that it was something you shouldn't have knowledge of and could have only got from the spirit world, that's the same kind of information maybe that a foreign agent would find useful.
Right.
So there's this suggestion that Houdini was doing it in the interest of national security, and there was a big there was a big congressional hearing about it where Houdini testified for several days. So it was kind of like ghost disclosure of the 1920s.
True.
And he got death threats. He had one medium saying that he would be dead before Halloween that year.
Yeah.
And then he died on
like
Halloween that year. Yeah.
Oh,
well, he did die on Halloween, though, is the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, guess
So leading
that
up
was
to
one medium.
Well, unless there were forces at play that self-fulfilled that prophecy. And there are people that would suggest that as well, that there was actually there was such big business in the seance industry that offing people once in a while was worthwhile for them, but especially if they could tell you what day it was going to happen in advance.
Yeah.
In any other case of murder or death, it would seem really suspicious if somebody said this guy's going to die on that day, that they die on that day.
Right. Yeah, a perfect crime.
Bode well. Yeah. So, my presentation was going to be really on the last 2 years right before his death, because he was in my hometown quite a bit during that time. And I found some interesting things there. So.
Yeah,
up to
he's
and
an interesting
including
guy.
his dinner with H.P. Lovecraft is kind of the beginning of that.
That's awesome.
He and Lovecraft had a relationship because there were like these adventure stories that were in, I think, oh, I'm gonna get it wrong now. It might have been Amazing Stories magazine.
Yeah, Amazing Stories.
Yeah. And there were stories ostensibly written from the first person's perspective of Houdini, but they were actually written by Lovecraft. Um,
Hmm.
so he and Lovecraft were collaborating, and they were going to write an encyclopedia of like occultism or what they called the occult. So I mean, a lot of seance type stuff. And same time, he was collaborating with William Gibson, the guy that wrote The Shadow later on, and a million other things. One of the most prolific pulp writers of all time, William Gibson. I imagine you guys must have covered him on one of your Patreon pulp magic episodes.
We weren't really.
No.
We were using the pulp term in kind of a loose, like our own way. So it wasn't really about like pulp, like classic pulp sci-fi fiction stuff. It was kind of more like.
Well, you covered the Fu Manchu stuff.
We did, yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of served our purpose a little more, but yeah, for sure.
The William Gibson stuff is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because he was working with Houdini, and then later he had that kind of there was that ghost being seen at the Gay Street apartment in part of New York where Gibson was living. What is it called? Boy, it was kind of like the real bohemian part of the city later on, but it plays into the idea of like tulpas, where the people were basically seeing the ghost of the shadow in the apartment building where William Gibson was writing The Shadow.
Yeah, I remember hearing that. Yeah, was it in the village?
And then John. Yes, Greenwich Village. Thank you. It wouldn't come to mind. What people were seeing was actually a ghost that resembled Lamont Cranston, the alter ego of the Shadow, like a man in a nightgown, like a evening gown with like a cape or like a cloak, and this was recorded by Hans Holzer in a book, and then later John Keel mentioned it to William Gibson, who mentioned that he lived at that apartment, and that Keel was the one that kind of put it together.
Yeah,
and I think it gets mentioned in the Mothman prophecies as like a concept of the tulpa,
right?
Which there's a lot of examples of that. But yeah, so during this time, that was Houdini was already collaborating with those two guys, and I think my hometown was the last place he ever did a buried alive trick. He basically stayed underwater for over an hour inside of a coffin, and then I mean, this was one of the last stops before he made his way to I think it was Toronto, where he got sucker punched, and then he ended up trying to perform in Detroit, and that was where he ultimately collapsed and was brought to the hospital and died.
Yeah, what are the details of that? So that's where people think it could have possibly been an assassin because somebody, propositioned him with you can take any punch, but hit him when he wasn't prepared or something like that, right?
The account of it that I think is most accurate is he was posing for a portrait, and he was in kind of a reclining position in like a chaise lounge kind of thing. So he was kind of leaning back, and the way that trick works is if you can tighten up your stomach muscles, you can actually physically move your organs out of the way of harm. If you can tense those muscles up enough, you can do it in a way that you can withstand a punch, and it's probably gonna hurt the guy's hand more than it's gonna hurt you. But if you're in a reclined position like that, there's no way, you're not gonna be able to do it. And it was an overzealous fan, but there's evidence to suggest the fan was actually an agent working for Marjorie Crandon, who is a Boston psychic that Houdini had embarrassed. Yeah, so he kept insisting on punching Houdini in the stomach, and Houdini agreed to it, but he kind of meant like, let me finish up this portrait, or like, let me stand up and get ready for it. And pretty much as soon as he said yes, he was like, all right, I'll let you. The guy just like pounced on him and started like wailing on him.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just one punch. Like the guy kind of like dove at him and stalked him a bunch of times, and basically until he said stop.
Mm-hmm.
Houdini was like, all right, that's good. That's quite enough. So, like, was that an assassination attempt? Who knows? But the thing is, it ruptured his appendix. It went septic, and then he was brought to the hospital in Detroit and was put on a course of antibiotics, had a surgery, and should have recovered. He was on the mend, and then all of a sudden went south really quick. And there's all these weird stories about like people at the hospital that weren't really doctors, but were like acting like doctors, or
Wow.
So the idea is that maybe somebody snuck in and slipped him something in his recovery from surgery, and because otherwise he would have survived. Now, if that was your assassination thing and you were trying to make it line up with Halloween, I can see why you would do it that way.
Right.
Yeah. Huh.
So, now
that's
it's entirely possible that medicine wasn't there quite enough yet to they thought he was getting better and then he got worse. This is 1926 we're talking about. Antibiotics probably weren't the best. Maybe there was something else going on, and Houdini was notorious for overdoing it, so he never should have been on stage to begin with a ruptured appendix and like 104 fever. But he was determined to have the show go on anyway when he collapsed.
Yeah.
And then other people point to that dinner with H.P. Lovecraft in Providence where Bess Houdini got really sick and had to go home back to New York, and from food poisoning. So people think maybe there was a poison that was meant for Houdini, but his wife ate it instead. I looked into this though, and Houdini's wife had a pet parrot at the time that was on her shoulder and on her head the whole time she was eating, and she was sharing food with it. So I think there was probably a zoonotic disease that might have contributed to her sickness that night.
Wow.
See, it's these little details that are really important.
Yeah.
You go sharing food with a bird, you might get sick.
Yeah, for sure. Birds are carrying like the most amount of parasites, right?
Yeah, it's just pooping on you the whole time, and like
that's brutal. Yeah, I wouldn't hang out with a bird like that.
It's weird that the bird was even in the restaurant too. It's weird they let the bird in the restaurant.
Yeah.
And I think Lovecraft was kind of like a germaphobe, so it's kind of weird that he tolerated it.
They probably didn't know, right? That birds had that many was carrying that many parasites and stuff.
Yeah, but I guess he used to eat at these places in Providence that were kind of like automats, those like automat diner places, because they had a reputation for being the cleanest places, and that was basically the only place that Lovecraft would eat, because like I guess he was really afraid of germs. But
that sounds like him. That does not surprise me.
Yeah.
Do you so where do you kind of fall on the tulpa concept? Like, do you think that this new myth of Crowley and Loch Ness is like reifying that, or like do you think that mythology reifies the Loch Ness Monster in some tulpic incarnation?
It could. I think it's possible. I tend to think that the more lighthearted Doc Shields approach is more efficacious. and I think he probably to me the Loch Ness Monster has always been one of those like fringe of fringe things, like a Weekly World News level cryptid. You know,
Yeah.
it's so silly, right? And you're just like, especially when you're picturing a living dinosaur, you're just like, it's just nuts. But I find that so inspiring that something that nuts could really exist, right? Um, so
Yeah.
I think the myth of Crowley summoning the Loch Ness monster by accident I think what people are thinking is that he opened up this portal and then just like left it open, and then all these things wandered in and out, and then later he came back and fixed it, and but Nessie got trapped here, and I mean I
Yeah.
think that's just kind of like a real Hollywood way of thinking about it, and I don't imagine that's true, right?
Right.
But but there may have always been some kind of worm or dragon that was indigenous to that loch. And Holiday makes a pretty cool case for the historical associations with giant serpents and dragons in that book, The Dragon in the Disc. And he's tracking down Irish lake monsters in lakes that are way too small to hold any kind of monster, you know,
Yeah.
that nevertheless they're seen in. So
Yeah, I love that stuff. The holiday books, they're all how many are there? 3 or 4 or so?
there's 4 that I know of.
Yeah.
You have the Great Orm of Loch Ness, and then the Dragon in the Disc, and those are the 2 that are more specifically
Yeah.
about the Loch Ness monster. Then the Goblin Universe, which was
Right.
posthumous,
And then,
and then there's
Yeah, that one's great too.
a handful of books on angling.
he wrote plenty about fishing, and that was his main job. Is he wrote for fisherman magazines
Right.
and outdoorsmen. But there's also the David Enigma, which he co-wrote with Randall Jones Pugh, and that book is phenomenal.
Huh.
It's
That I'm
about
unfamiliar
UFO.
with.
Oh, that is it's all UFOs in West Wales in the late 1970s.
Okay.
Pembrokeshire, the Broadhaven school landing is in there. The Ripperston Farm stuff, high
Okay, that
weirdness in
actually
West
rings
Wales.
a bell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Professor Wham?
Yeah,
She
of course.
she really recently did a video on this. She's been
Oh,
doing these
okay.
little videos about books
Yeah.
that are a little bit more obscure, and she did a whole half hour to an hour. I don't remember how long it was, but it's just a video just about this book. So if you look
Oh,
at
that's
her
great.
website, look at her website, and you can have her explain it to you. I'm gonna defer
Yeah.
everybody to Professor Wham because she's more
Yeah, we need to
knowledgeable.
get her on. I've been meaning to have her on for like a long time now. Someday.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
hard to
you two could absolutely talk some Eugenie Macer story, and that would.
That's right. Yeah, we've talked about her a lot. She was one of the first people who I kind of got into, who kind of understood the work, and we could have like a dialogue about it. And
Yeah,
yeah, she's great. Huh.
yeah, no, Wham best.
Um,
So
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it might be a good time to wrap up the
sure.
conversations. Um, where can people kind of get into your territory? Where should people go?
Well, you can go to apstrange.com, and that's where you'll find my writings if you're inclined to read some writings. And on the little sidebar there is the RSS for my podcast, which is available on all the podcast platforms, as well as YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. And if you go to my YouTube channel, I also do I have more or less weekly videos called Selections from the Weird Library, where I feature just a couple books, some of which I bought at Apport Used Books, which is a
Hell yeah.
wonderful bookstore that you should support. But they're fun. I just take a couple books off the shelf and talk about them and explain what I love about them, and or and why they're important. So some of the ones I mentioned tonight, I actually have covered on those videos. So there's one called Spiritism and Common Sense that was written by a priest who lived in Worcester and taught in Worcester, where I live, and was a good friend of Houdini's. So I've covered Monstrum, the Shields book on there. I might have covered The Dragon and the Disc. If not, I will. And the David Enigma. I covered that in one of them. So basically the podcast, the blog, and the videos.
Yeah, it's a good idea highlighting books like that. It's kind of
apparently Wham had the same idea.
Yeah.
And we even picked one of the same books. But yeah, I would recommend her video over mine because I'm basically just geeking out about David Enigma for like 5.
That's the way to do it. Yeah, the books are the best. Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole idea. Is I collect them. I have tons of them. I've read a lot of them. I probably never will read all of them, but
Nah. No, I've given up on that. I just let them kind of live here for a while and then move on, or
but I never know which one I'm going to read next. I literally don't.
Right.
I could just have a.
That's what's great about.
Yeah.
A collection. You just kind of have the potentiality of the collection is what's valuable, I think.
Yeah, I mean that is the dream, and I am in fact living it at this point because it's just I always wanted to have a vast resource and be like have somebody ask me a question and go, I have a book on that. Hold on.
Yeah, there you go.
So
yeah, that's kind of what it, like. If people ask us like what the show's about, I won't exactly be like it's about the occult or it's about UFOs. I'll just be like it's mostly about books, just about cool books.
I will say though, as much as I'm a proponent for books, there are those within esotericism that would criticize the readers that never do, the ones that only read. So I would recommend that people, if you are going to engage with occultism, you should read quite a bit.
Oh yeah,
and you should learn everything you can. But if you have any practical experience and you actually start to experience things, like you get a little bit of a better understanding of the gravity of what's happening in these books. And I worry that a lot of people speak out of turn without having any real experience of what that is. I think it's helpful to have it. Even just synchronicities,
as long as you don't,
you'll find those.
Right. Those are almost unavoidable as soon as you start reading the books. So
yeah, it's an initiation of it in and of itself. I like to think.
Yeah. Huh. Cool. Yeah, I feel like we could go on for a long time talking about this stuff. So, well, have you back on sometime. That would be great.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Yeah. I'm sure we've got a million things we could talk to you about.
Yeah, I feel like I just kept going tonight, so I hope
that's what we need.
I hope that was okay.
No, we're just scratching the surface. I feel like, but
yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Recording stopped.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks again for joining us.
Of course, anytime.
I'm excited to check out your YouTubes and stuff and everything. And the podcast is kind of new, right?
Yeah, I just launched it in October. So probably should have said this on the recording, but basically the way it's been working is I have one episode that's kind of like like an interview or on a specific weird topic, and then the next episode is about a movie. So every other is just kind of, so I do the movie episodes I do are called Third Time's a Charm, and I talk about the third movie in a franchise. So the way it's worked out so far is it's been every other episode has been a third movie episode. So
that's awesome. Yeah, I'm still recording over here. I'll include this in the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah, we've been kind of chatting a lot of movies on the show too. For the fall we were kind of mapping the Black Mass in film and watching a lot of like Hammer horror stuff and
cool.
A million Boris Karloffs about cults,
The Black Cat.
Oh, it's one of my favorites. Yeah,
I love that movie. Yeah. That's a great one. Yeah.
I was watching Snake People the other night, which is like a Boris Karloff voodoo one.
Oh, cool.
Really cool. Yeah, the ritual sequences are like pretty debaucherous. It's funny.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that one. I always liked White Zombie for that.
White Zombie rules. The hammer, the devil rides out.
Oh yeah.
The Crimson Altar was really good with Boris Karloff and Christopher Lee. I really like that one a lot. Bunch of other ones.
Did you ever see? I think it's just called Witchcraft with Lon Chaney.
Maybe. What year?
I don't think I've seen
What
that.
year is that from? 50s?
It's in the 60s.
Okay.
It's in the 60s. I think it's 1960.
Nice.
It's black and white still, but it's a British. Well, if it's not British, it feels like one. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. I don't think I have
that's
seen
cool.
this,
Yeah,
which is
I haven't
crazy.
seen that either. Yeah.
It is a really good one.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of got that same folk horror, like hidden magician family feel to it. Yeah.
Huh.
Oh, great.
There's always more. I always think I've seen all of these.
Dude,
these
this
movies,
one's got
and there's
some
always more.
awesome posters, man. But yeah,
It does. Well, it lives up to the posters too. That's the thing. It's like sometimes you have an awesome poster and then the movie's just kind of slow.
yeah,
But
Yeah.
that one's pretty. That keeps your interest the whole time. And it looks cool. Like it has a lot of really cool looking scenes in it. So
sweet. Yeah, I'll check that out.
Lon Chaney was still on his game too, which like by that time he was
Yeah.
appearing in a lot of things and he was kind of like drunk on set. So
Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. We look forward to having you back on. Definitely.
yeah. All right. Well, just let me know. You guys know where to find me.
All
So-
right. All right.
Oh, yeah.
Take
All
care. Have a good night.
Yep. You too.
Nice. I'm still recording over here, Ben.
Cool. Let's keep going.
Let's keep rolling here. That was awesome.
Let's roll.
That was cool.
Yeah,
lot of
great
good
conversation.
stuff.
It's fun when somebody's like on, the same wavelength in terms of, even like within this realm. I think
Definitely.
we kind of are,
Visit patreon.com/consensusunreality to listen to this episode, subscribe to our printed journals and receive regular, exclusive episodes and more. Beware the changing story.